Luke chapter 15, verses 1 through 32 is where we'll be, and we will learn about 3 stories, 2 groups, and 1 priority. 3 stories, 2 groups, and 1 priority. So if you're taking notes, you can kind of use that as a guideline and a roadmap for where we're going. But let's jump in. Luke chapter 15, here's how the story begins. Now, the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to him. Tax collectors and sinners, these people were 2 categories of unclean and untouchable in the Jewish first century. I mean, these are the people that you don't want your kids to hang out with. These are the people you don't want your kids to grow up with. These were the worst of the worst in the eyes and the perspective of the Jewish community in which this reality is being told. And so Luke documents that everywhere Jesus, this Jewish rabbi, went, everywhere Jesus, this holy man, went, people who were nothing like him kept on following him. In a lot of ways, these people in Jewish culture were outsiders. That's your first group for your notes. These people were the outsiders. They were your kind of like fill in the blank people. You know, the ugly people, or, those people over there, or the not my people. Like, have you ever been to a party or went to a party, right? You walked in because a friend of yours invited you and you realized, these are not my people. Have you ever kind of had that happen before, right? Yeah, these were the people that the Jewish community did not want anything to do with. And what I find so intriguing about Jesus, I mean, if you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you're not going to be able to get away from this reality. It's something that's been messing with my mind. And I want you to write it down in your notes because I want you to remember it. Is that the people who were nothing like Jesus liked Jesus. People who were nothing like him. I mean, Jesus was holy and righteous and kind and generous, and he never looked at a woman with lust in his eyes. And yet, prostitutes couldn't get enough of him. Jesus was smart and he knew the scriptures better than anyone else, and people who had flunked out of Jewish rabbi school wanted to hang out with him. Jesus was the most generous, integrity-filled person that ever lived, and yet the people like tax collectors who stole from their own people wanted to hang out with him. Jesus was interesting. Jesus had this magnetic, attractive personality to him that made the people that should have resisted him the most find him to be the most irresistible. People who were nothing like Jesus liked spending time with him. And so this group, these outsiders, are going to be in a crowd surrounding Jesus. And they're not the only people that are there. In verse 2, we find the second group that you can put down in your notes. And the Pharisees and the scribes were there. And Pharisees and scribes were the direct opposite, the polar opposite of the tax collectors and the sinners. These people were the religious elites. They went to the best schools. They had the best resources, the best finances. They came from really good family. They were old money. Many of them were in vocational ministry. They were highly educated, highly religious, and they dotted every I and they crossed every single T. These people were considered the insiders. They were the ones that were close to God. They were the ones that knew the right answers. They were the people who had the connections in the right place to always get the right job, to call the guy at the DMV to make sure that you can cut the line. I mean, these guys were the ones that had the close connection to God. They had the individual line. They knew how to get to him, and they were inside, and everyone who wasn't like them was outside. And they are around Jesus as well. And we find this. The Pharisees and the scribes, they grumbled. They grumbled saying, this man, referring to Jesus, he receives sinners and he eats with them. And that would have been like a knife in the back of Jewish culture, because there are 2 holy places in Jewish culture. The first one was the temple. This is where people went to worship. And the second was the table. And in Jewish culture, you did not let anybody unclean or untouchable come near your table because it was such a holy place. And Jesus the rebel rabbi, would sit down and eat with the unclean, the untouchable, the undignified, and the Jewish elites could not understand how this insider named Jesus could ever spend time with those outsiders, the tax collectors and the Pharisees. And if we're honest, we can kind of resonate with this, right? Because can we be honest? Insiders tend to be frustrated by outsiders. And if you don't believe me, I'll prove it to you in a minute, right? I'm going to say 2 words, right? And it'll kind of create some emotion in you. Tourist drivers, right? Can't stand them. They're so frustrating, right? There is a way that we drive a vehicle in Orlando, right? And it is crazy, right? That's the word that I would use to describe it. But there's a way we drive. But you know this, right? You're on I-4, you're heading down to downtown Disney, right? Disney Springs, you're kind of going out there for a meal. You're going to Universal Studios, right? And you got some random person from Canada who can't figure out what in the world to do. You got this English mate, who's walking around with a fanny pack. There's a part of you When you see an English man with a fanny pack that says, seriously, right? That's just the honest truth. Because we're insiders. We've got a way that we do things. And when outsiders enter into our story, we get frustrated because they don't know the rules and they don't play by the rules. And as a result of that, we tend to get upset. So the Jewish people have rules about how you're supposed to relate to God. The Jewish people have rules, especially the Pharisees, on how you're supposed to be cleaned up and put together to be before God. And Jesus, this man who says he represents God, is breaking all of the rules and allowing the outsiders in. And the insiders can't stand it. So it's in this backdrop that Jesus is about to tell 3 incredible stories. And these 3 stories give us an insight into the heart of the Father, the heart of God, that is so different than maybe the religion you grew up with as a kid, or the experience of Christian faith that you've been taught or that you've seen from afar. Jesus told them this parable. And a parable is an ordinary story that makes an extraordinary point. Jesus is going to tell 3 prodigal parables. Now, when you hear the word prodigal, there's probably something that comes to mind, right? What does the word prodigal mean? Now, for me growing up as a kid, I thought the word prodigal meant like a person who went off the rails, right? Like I remember, if there was a person in our family, a cousin that was kind of going crazy, they'd be like, oh, that's the prodigal, right? Or, the black sheep of the family, the one who does something completely different. That's what I thought the word prodigal meant. But the reality is that that's not what the word prodigal means. The word prodigal means this. I want you to write it down, okay? Maybe you've never heard this before. Prodigal is someone or something that is recklessly extravagant or having spent everything. A prodigal is somebody who lives with no bank account. A prodigal is somebody who hears Dave Ramsey say, you need to have, an emergency fund. They're like, I'm good. Like that's what a prodigal is. And a book that's been really helpful to me that I would commend to you in this area, if you're interested in what we're going to talk about in Luke 15, and you want to learn it for yourself, is a book called The Prodigal God by Tim Keller. The Prodigal God. It's a great, great read that helps unpack some of what I'm going to talk about today in Luke 15. But we're going to hear 3 stories today that maybe you've heard before. And I want you to realize these are prodigal parables. Story number 1 is a story that we grew up hearing it called the story or the story of the lost sheep, the parable of the lost sheep. But I want to give you a different title because that's not the right title for the story. Because the story is not about the sheep as much as it's about the shepherd. Story number 1 isn't the story of the lost sheep. It's the story of the prodigal shepherd, the extravagant, wasteful shepherd. So Jesus leans in, the greatest storyteller that has ever walked the face of the earth. And he starts with this story. He says this in verse 4. What man of you, having 100 sheep, if he has lost one of them, does not leave the 99 in the open country, underline open country, and go after the one that is lost until he finds it? Now, the Pharisees and the people listening to this story would say, well, I would not leave the 99 to go find one. And here's the reason why. When they heard the word sheep, we just hear the word sheep, right? That's what you think of. But when they heard the word sheep, they saw it spelt a little bit of a different way. That's how they saw it spelled. Because sheep was a reflection of wealth. And so if you were a shepherd, you were entrusted by some rich man's money, and your job was to take care of the sheep because the sheep equaled money. And so if you were responsible for 100 sheep and you lost one of them, you were going to get in trouble for losing one. But do you know how much more trouble you would get in for losing 99? A ton. And the text says that the shepherd leaves the 99, not in a pen, not with some friends, not with a couple of babysitters that they're paying you $10 an hour, like not in that situation, but leaves the 99 in the open country. Meaning sheep are dumb and they're probably going to wander off, right? They don't all just stay there. Like the shepherd can't look at the 99 and say, all right, here's the deal. Jimmy the sheep has been a very bad boy. Like he can't say that and then say, now stay here. I'm going to go find him. It doesn't work that way. So they're kind of leaning in thinking, oh my gosh, like why would you leave the one? If you're a shepherd, your sheep are what you value most. And so the people listening to this story would have been like, I don't know if I would leave the 99 to find the one. Maybe you're saying that seems kind of irresponsible. I don't know if I would do that. And then Jesus continues on with the story. And when he has found the sheep, he lays it on his shoulders, rejoicing. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends and his neighbors, saying to them, rejoice with me, for I found my sheep was lost. He throws a huge party for the lost sheep, of which everyone in the crowd is saying, you don't throw a party for one lost sheep, Jesus, because you don't want your owner to know that you lost the sheep. Like, come on. But Jesus is trying to prove a bigger point. Here's the bigger point, because it's not about a sheep. It's about a shepherd. So the shepherd risks everything he has to find the lost one. This is prodigal love. This is extravagant, exceptional, unconditional, risk everything love. So Jesus, explaining his story, says, just so I tell you, there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who need no repentance. It's why we clap when people say yes to make a decision to follow Jesus, because we're just reflecting what heaven has been doing when people say yes to him. And before the Pharisees can jump in or try to correct Jesus' theology like Pharisees tried to, he jumps into the second story. The story that we think of as the lost coin, but really the better title for it is the story of the prodigal woman. Verse 8, Jesus says, or what woman, having 10 silver coins, if she loses one of them, does not light a lamp and sweep the house and seek diligently until she finds it? So now all the women are leaning in, right? Because they've never heard a woman be the main character of the story. And Jesus is saying that there's a woman who's got 10 coins, she's lost one of them, and she flips her house over looking for the one coin. And here's the reason why. In the first century Jewish culture, men, fathers, would give their daughters coins that they could wear as jewelry as a sign to let people in the community know that they were single and ready to mingle. You didn't know this, did you, right? But this is what they would do. So 10 coins was a good amount of money. So the whole point was this: a single guy would see a gal, and a single guy might see a gal today and see her with a Louis Vuitton bag and see her with a Mercedes-Benz SLK and say, she might come from a rich daddy. Like that's what they had, to have today. Back then, the reality was that wasn't the case. So the coins were an indicator of status. So you needed to make sure you had all your coins before you went out to the club on Friday night, or you don't go to the club because we're Jewish, so we went to the temple on Friday night, whatever, right? We told mom and dad we were going to the temple. I know some of y'all did that, right? And did something else on Friday night. Anyways, as you're going out, you want to make sure you've got all your stuff, because this is the way you communicate your status and value. So losing a coin's a pretty big deal. So she flips the house. I lost my keys today. If you know anything about me, I lose my keys all of the time. Like this is not a new thing, right? But can I tell you, if you were to walk into my house right now, every single seat cushion is thrown onto the floor. Sheets of paper are everywhere. The sheets are ripped off of my bed. If you could have been at my home around 8 a.m. this morning, you would have heard a man screaming, running around like a crazy man, thinking, where are my keys? Why? Because the house gets flipped when you're looking for that thing that you need the most. So she flips her house upside down to find the one coin. And so verse 9, Jesus says, and when she's found it, she calls together her friends and neighbors saying, rejoice with me, for I have found the coin that I had lost. Again, no one is throwing a party in real life for this, but it's a story. People let Jesus have his way. All right, that's what's going on. Here's what I want you to get out of this story. It's the story of the prodigal woman, not the lost coin. See, the woman stops everything she's doing to find the lost coin. She stops everything she's doing to find the one coin that's lost. And here's the reason why. This is prodigal love. It's recklessly crazy on the outside looking at it. We don't understand why. Love. Verse 10, so just so as I tell you, there is joy before the angels of God over one sinner, just one sinner who repents. And at this point, the outsiders, the tax collectors, the sinners, the people who were relegated to the outsides of society, the people that could not be touched, the untouched, unclean, undignified people, they were amazed at Jesus' teaching because they had never heard the story of a God that could love them that way. For the first time in their life, there was actually some hope. That maybe if they didn't get everything figured out and get everything cleaned up, and if they, couldn't get over the regret that they had done, that maybe there was a way for them to be found again. And while the outsiders were amazed, the insiders, the ones who thought they knew God best, they were offended. They were so upset at the idea or the concept that God, or even Jesus, who they didn't believe was God, could have the audacity to say that the father or the shepherd or the woman would risk 99 to find one, flip the house to find one, and then throw a big party when it happened. But let's be honest. How do you feel, just go emotional with me for a second, how do you feel when something you value is lost? Isn't there a sense in you that when something is lost, you need to find it, especially if it's important to you, right? Yeah. Let me ask you a second question. I want you to lean in with me a little bit more if you can. What do you focus on when something you value is lost? A couple of weeks ago, I was responsible for watching our kids. 3 of the 4. The 4th can't be with me yet because he needs mama and he's kind of at that age. So 3 of the 4, right? So I'm 1 on 3. It's a little bit stressful. Kids are out on the playground, running around, having fun. And I'll be honest with you, okay? Just confession, open confession. I'm not always the greatest dad. There are things that I can grow in. And one of the things I can grow in is being able to have more eyes, okay? So my 2-year-old Jackson took off and I did not know where he was. It's a frightening moment in our home. Frightening moment for me, right? Let me ask you this question. If I came home from the park, walked in the house, Stacy was there with our youngest, Ollie, walked in with Emma and Elise, and Stacy looked at me and said, Colin, where's Jackson? I said, I lost him, but I've got Emma and Elise. Like, how do you think that's working out in my house? It's not working out, right? Because when you lose something you value, your energy and focus is not on the things you have, it is solely focused on the thing you don't have. And Jesus, Jesus is laying before these people a version of love they have never heard before, that he is more concerned. He's more concerned about what's lost than what is found. And the Pharisees and the religious elites, they are so upset at this story. And Jesus has not even begun to offend them to the degree that he's going to offend them. Because then he turns the story, not from a woman that the Pharisees could not identify with, not to a shepherd who the Pharisees couldn't identify with because they were too wealthy and they were too masculine to deal with those 2 stories. But then he's going to bring it right home in the 3rd story. And the 3rd story is the story that we know about as the prodigal, and we call it the prodigal son. That's maybe how you grew up hearing about it. But I want to give you a different title for this story today. The story about the son who left home and came back. Because I don't think it's the story of the prodigal son as much as it's the story of a prodigal father. The prodigal father. Let's lean into the story together. Verse 11. And Jesus said, there was a man who had 2 sons. And the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of property that is coming to me. At this point, when Jesus says these words, there would have been a gasp in the crowd because in Jewish culture, you never speak to a father that way. It was a shame in honor culture, so you always brought deference to your dad. You would never tell your father, Father, I want my money now. I want my inheritance now. In effect, what this man is saying to his father, the younger son, is, Dad, you're dead to me. I really don't care about our relationship. I really don't care about getting to be close with you. To be honest with you, all you are is a means to an end to me. So let's stop pretending like I love you or I care about you or the reason why I'm in this house is actually because I care about you at all. Let's just stop pretending, Dad. The real reason why I want you here or why I'm around you is because I want the reward. It's kind of like Christians who are like, the only reason I'm really, if I'm honest, in a relationship with God is because I want the reward of heaven. It's not because I actually want him, I just want the things he can give me. And so the son's like, come on, Dad, let's be real. You know it, I know it, I don't want a relationship with you, so why don't you just give me what is yours? And Jesus, as he's telling this story, would say, and he. Now stop there. Because everyone in the room is kind of tensing up at this moment. Because everyone agrees that you don't speak to a father that way, that the right thing to do is for the father to punish the son. The right thing to do is for the father to banish the son. And so everyone kind of, I could interpret it in modern days, expecting the next verse to read a little bit like this. And he took away his cell phone, grounded him forever, and canceled Netflix. That's what they're expecting. But Jesus thinks differently than we do. He leads differently than we do. He loves differently than we do. And instead, verse 12 says this, and he divided his property between them. Property is something that had to be sold. So it means the father had to go sell his property and make less money off it than probably if he could hold out. Had to get as much cash as he could to give to his son to represent a third of the family's holdings. In verse 13, not many days later, so this didn't take long, the younger son gathered all he had and took a journey into a far country. And there he squandered his property in reckless living. And the reason why we call this story the story of the prodigal son is not because the son left home. The reason why the story is called the story of the prodigal son, that's why you grew up with it that way, why I grew up with it that way in church if you grew up in church, is because of this phrase, he squandered his property. Because the word reckless and prodigal were words that were connected and tied together. The prodigal son was a person who was spending everything. Reckless equals prodigal. Prodigal, spending money or resources freely and recklessly, wastefully extravagant. The son was wastefully extravagant. Flew out to Vegas, maxed out his credit cards, had a bunch of women hanging out with him, partied really, really hard. posted about it on Instagram. The community knew what was going on. The father had to live with all of that shame. And when he had spent everything, verse 14, severe famine arose in that country and he began to be in need. The women left. Alcohol ran dry. The eviction notice came. So the son went out and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country. This would have been such a shocking statement. A Jewish man working for someone who was not Jewish, who sent him into his fields, and this would make it even worse. It would be like Jesus dropped a curse word in the middle of the room to feed pigs. There would have been a gasp because Jewish people could not associate with, touch, or even be around what they considered to be ceremonially unclean pigs. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. The son had been demoted to slave. Verse 17, but when he came to himself, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him. Have you ever had an opportunity or a moment in your life where you're thinking, oh my gosh, I'm about to have a tough conversation with my boss, so you preempt the conversation with your boss by having the conversation to yourself? You ever done that before? Or you're in an argument with somebody, right? And then you replay the argument after you're leaving, after you've left the argument, as you're driving down the road, that like great quick one-liner came into your mind, like, oh, I wish I had it at that moment. That's what he's doing. He's practicing what he's going to say to his father, like you and I do when we're scared and not sure how the relationship is going to go. We want to get every word just right. We want to figure out what we're going to say. So he practices to himself, Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Would you treat me as one of your hired servants? In verse 20, and he rose and he came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And Luke chapter 15, verse 20 is one of the most scandalous verses in all of Scripture. Because Jewish men do not run. And Jewish men definitely do not run to their sons that have stabbed them in the back. And Jewish men do not run to sons that have stabbed them in their back and hug them and kiss them, because that would be a sign of you laying down all of your honor and dignity for someone who deserves none of yours. And yet, the father sitting on his front porch while he's a long way off with his eyes on the road sees his son walking back. And he doesn't wait for his son to grovel and get to the front porch. He doesn't kind of cross his arms in a sense of righteous indignation and vindication, saying it's about time you came back. But the father embraces full embarrassment and lays down his dignity and honor, and he races to his son. Tears would have begun to well up in the eyes of the tax collectors and the sinners who knew that they were the people that had wasted their life. And the father, the earthly father that turned their back on them, the earthly father that said, you're no good, the earthly father that would have looked at the tax collector and said, you've betrayed your people and country, you're never welcome in my home, would for the first time in a long time hear about a story of a father who would be willing to embrace them no matter what. Tim Keller, in his book, The Prodigal God, says the word prodigal is an appropriate term for describing the father in the story, because the father's welcome to the repentant son was literally reckless, because he refused to reckon or count his sin against him or demand repayment. This response offended the elder son, who we're going to hear about here in just a second, and most likely the local community. Because while tears are welling up in the eyes of the outsiders, the insiders' arms are getting to fold. They're beginning to back away. They're beginning to roll their eyes. They're beginning to grab their Bibles and try to find the Bible verse that they can find in the Old Testament to prove this rabbi, rebel, theologian wrong. They were getting ready to go to war. In verse 21, and the son said to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father, instead of saying, yeah, that's right, said to his servants, bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, a sign that the son had come home. Bring quickly and put on a ring on his hand. The ring would have been a signet ring that would be used to stamp documents that would be officially used to sell and make trade, meaning the son is not just welcome back in my home, but his position in our family has been restored, and he has full rights to every ounce of the inheritance. shoes on his feet, and bring the fattened calf and kill it and let us eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead and is alive again. Oh, he was lost and is found. And they began to celebrate. And reading this text this week, it just wrecked me. Because I think so often in life, we think that our faith is about returning to God and figuring out how we're gonna do enough to be good enough for him. That if God would just take me back to be a hired servant, that I would be happy with that. And God says, I'm never gonna make you my hired servant. You're always my son first. Like, think about this. The son recklessly spent a third of everything the father owned, and he cannot get it back. And when the son returns home, the invitation is not to just come home and kind of be a part of the family now. The invitation is, I'm gonna take the third that's been sold. Now I only have 2/3 of what's left. And that 2/3 that was supposed to be for me and your older brother is now gonna be divided in 3 again. Because you're my son. And all of mine is all of yours. God loves us. He loves you and 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 you. He loves us with a prodigal, wasteful, absurd, I cannot understand it, extravagant love. God loves humanity with a prodigal, extravagant love. And the outsiders listening to this story were inspired, the idea that there could be a love like this available to them. And the insiders, they were offended because this broke every rule they had built their life on. They built their life on dotting I's and crossing T's and doing the right thing all of the time, thinking in some ways doing the right thing would lead to right favor with God. And Jesus is flipping the narrative upside down in this moment, saying, no, my love is extravagant and never ending. Alex Early writes in his book, The Reckless Love of God, the only thing more reckless than the son's rebellion in this story is the father's grace. This is what grace actually looks like. It's extravagant and completely over the top. It appears wasteful, excessive, and totally senseless. And yet, this is the love of our Heavenly Father. Now, while the insiders are offended and irritated, the outsiders are feeling inspired, Jesus is going to direct his attention to those that do not like what they have heard. And maybe he even now is directing his attention to those of us in the room who do not like what we have just heard in present time and day. He continues with this story. Now, his older son was in the field. And as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. And he called one of the servants and asked, what do these things mean? And he said to him, your brother has come. And your father has killed the fattened calf because he has received him back safe and sound. And the son who's older is not excited about this news. He's not overjoyed about it. Instead, he is angry and he refused to go into the party. So his father, the same loving, unconditional, grace-filled, 70 times 7, I'm never gonna stop loving you, father, comes out to the son whose arms are crossed, throwing a pity party, and he entreats his son, meaning he begs his son to join in on the party. And his son answered his father, look, these many years I've served you, and I never disobeyed your command, that you never gave me a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. You love your younger brother more than you love me. But when this son of yours came, right, not my brother, right, which is how we sometimes treat people who don't think like us, talk like us, or believe like us, not realizing we share a common humanity. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed a fattened calf for him. And the father replied, son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. It was fitting to celebrate and be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost, and now he's found. Son, why are you so focused on what you don't have when you have me? You see, the problem with the older son and the younger son is the same problem. The older son saw the father as a means to an end. If I do the right things, the father owes me something. And the younger son said, I don't want to do the right things. I just want what I'm owed anyway. But both of them did not have a love relationship with the father. They saw the father as a means to an end. And yet Jesus would say, even when we see him wrongly, even when we allow our own desires to trump what is best, his love for us does not run out. Tim Keller would write, God's reckless grace is our greatest hope. That's about grace. It's not about what we do for God. It's not about what we haven't done for God. It's about who he is and what he's done for us. Grace is unmerited, unconditional love. Unmerited, unconditional love. Which is our Jesus is statement today is this, that Jesus is the shepherd seeking the lost sheep. Jesus is the woman flipping the house to find the lost coin. Jesus is the father who runs with open arms to his son. He is the prodigal God. He's an extravagant, unconditional, forever loving, never runs dry, can never run out of love for you, God. Which means this, that there are three stories and two groups of people, that Jesus has one priority, and I want you to write it down. Because Jesus' prodigal priority, his unconditional love priority is to seek and save those outside of God's forever family, no matter the cost. How extravagant was he willing to be? How prodigal was he willing to be? He'll leave the 99. He'll stop everything. He will welcome you home. And to lay down his very life for people that spit at him and mock at him and laugh at him. And he'll stand hanging on a cross, suffocating to death, having the power and capacity at any moment to call down angels and walk off of the cross. He will stand there and say, Father, forgive them because they don't know what they're doing. To what extent will God be willing to go to receive those who are far from him? He's willing to go this far. So if you're not a Christian, and maybe the reason you're not a Christian is because the story you've heard about God is a story of a man who's ready to pounce on you at any moment and ruin your life. And that the rules and regulations are way too high and there's no way you'd ever be able to finish them. And Christianity is a bunch of fake people with fake stories, living with masks. I want to tell you, I'm sorry. I'm sorry if that's a story that you've heard, because that is not the heart of our God. The heart of our God is a God who sees us as we are and loves us as we are, not the version of us that we're going to be. He loves us and runs with arms wide open. All he wants is a heart that's ready to respond. And so if you're a Christian, or rather if you're not a Christian, and you kind of would consider yourself an outsider of this whole faith thing, I want to invite you into the love of an extravagant God who cares for you, knows you by name, and has been chasing you down. Maybe the reason why you're in this room is because you wanted to reintroduce you or introduce you to the first time to his love. If you want to have a conversation about this, we would love to treat you to coffee or lunch. I would invite you to fill out your Connect card and simply let us know that you want to have a bigger conversation about the relentless love of the extravagant Father. But as an outsider, I want you now to have eyes to kind of be the fly on the wall as I begin to talk to the insiders, the people that are in our church. Because if you're an insider and you consider yourself a Christian, I want to invite you into a way of rethinking church for a minute if I can. I want to invite you into a way of rethinking your purpose and journey in life. Here's the question I would pose to those of us that consider ourselves insiders. If the church is the body of Christ, then who should we prioritize? If Jesus' heart and head is tied to seeking the lost, finding the coin, and welcoming the son back home, if that's his heart and head, and we are his hands and feet, what should be our priority? Because hear me, churches that prioritize insiders over outsiders have missed their purpose. And I want to say this right now, and I'll say it over and over and over again, that our church is not just for us. It's not about what we can get from it. It's not about what we like about it or how we feel about it. It's not whether or not we enjoy it. Church is not primarily for us. If you're a Christian, if you're an insider, our church is for those who aren't here yet.